Hello, and welcome back to LPBW Update, your number one source for the latest news and deepest insights into the world of little people, big world. Today, we are bringing you an exclusive report on a story so dark, so shocking, it threatens to shatter the very foundation of the Roloff family forever. What we are about to share comes from insider reports and exclusive theories pieced together from sources close to the family, painting a disturbing picture of jealousy, manipulation, and an unthinkable betrayal. The story alleges that Caryn Chandler, feeling her position in Matt Roloff's life threatened, took a step into darkness that no one could have ever imagined. It is being said she weaponized a government agency against Matt's own son and daughter-in-law, Zach and Tori Roloff, by making a malicious and anonymous call to Child Protective Services in an attempt to have their children taken away. This is the story of that ultimate betrayal. Before we dive into the shocking details of how this horrifying plot was allegedly executed and ultimately exposed, we need your support to continue bringing you these in-depth reports. If you believe families should be protected and that the truth always needs to come to light, take a moment right now to hit that like button, subscribe to LPBW Update, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a critical update on this developing story. Your engagement helps us immensely. Now, let's get into the unthinkable. To truly understand the depth of this alleged betrayal, we must first go back and examine the subtle, almost invisible fractures that began to form within the Roloff family dynamic. For years, Caryn Chandler has been a fixture at Roloff Farms, first as a longtime employee and then as Matt Roloff's partner. Her position seemed secure, her influence undeniable. She was the one by Matt's side, helping him run the pumpkin patch, manage his projects, and navigate his life post-divorce. In many ways, she has stepped into the role of the farm's matriarch, a position of power and familial importance. But according to our sources, a new power center was emerging within the family, one that Caryn could neither control nor influence. The powerful, loving, and ever-growing family unit of Zach and Tori. Tori Roloff, in particular, became an unexpected threat to Caryn's perceived status. Unlike an employee or a new partner, Tori was blood, or rather, married into it. She was the mother of Matt's grandchildren, the woman who held the key to the next generation of Roloffs. As Jackson, Lila, and Josiah were born, the family's center of gravity began to shift. Matt, like any loving grandfather, was utterly captivated by his grandchildren. The joy they brought him was immense, and he showered them, and, by extension, Zach and Tori, with time, affection, and attention. Insiders report that this shift was palpable. Family gatherings began to revolve more around the schedules of the young children. Conversations at the dinner table were dominated by cute anecdotes about Jackson's latest discovery or Lila's developing personality. For Caryn, this was allegedly a bitter pill to swallow. She saw the adoration in Matt's eyes when he looked at his grandchildren, and she saw the deep, unbreakable bond he shared with Zach and Tori as parents. Sources claim she began to feel less like a partner and more like a third wheel in Matt's own family life. Tori, with her natural warmth and role as a mother, was effortlessly becoming the central female figure in the family's heart, a role Caryn had worked so hard to cultivate for herself. This wasn't just about jealousy, it was about a perceived loss of influence and control. Caryn's relationship with Matt was built on the foundation of the farm and their shared life there. But Zach and Tori were building a new foundation for the family, one based on love, children, and legacy, a foundation where Caryn was, by definition, an outsider. The first signs of this internal conflict, we're told, manifested as small, passive-aggressive comments, so subtle they could be easily dismissed as genuine concern. These comments were almost always directed at Tori's parenting. After a family visit, Caryn might say to Matt in private, "Tori seems so exhausted. I hope she's getting enough sleep. 3 kids is a lot to handle. On the surface, it's a caring remark, but underneath, the alleged subtext was clear. Tori is overwhelmed and perhaps not coping well. These seeds of doubt were planted carefully and deliberately. She would allegedly use the children's dwarfism as a tool for her manipulation, leveraging Matt's own anxieties about their health. She would watch the kids play, and if one of them took a minor tumble, she'd later remark to Matt, with their shorter limbs, their balance is different. I just worry they're not being watched closely enough on that playground equipment. Each comment was a small cut designed to create a narrative in Matt's mind that there was a problem that he, and by extension Caryn, needed to be concerned about. She was framing herself as the vigilant, caring pseudo-grandmother, while subtly painting Tori as overwhelmed, distracted, and potentially negligent. One insider described a particularly telling incident. The family was gathered for a barbecue, and Jackson, being an adventurous little boy, had a small scrape on his knee from playing earlier in the day. It was a normal childhood badge of honor. Later that evening, Caryn allegedly pulled Matt aside, her voice laced with manufactured worry. "I'm a little worried about that new bruise on Jackson's knee," she reportedly said. "That's the 3rd one this month. Kids will be kids, of course, but it just seems to be happening so often over there." She was a master of plausible deniability. If confronted, she could always claim she was just being a concerned member of the family. But the cumulative effect of these comments was insidious. She was building a file in Matt's mind, a collection of seemingly small incidents that, when strung together, could suggest a pattern of inattentiveness. Matt, who loves his grandchildren more than anything, was being expertly manipulated. He wasn't being turned against Zach and Tori, not directly. Instead, he was being conditioned to worry about them, to see their parenting through a lens of anxiety that Caryn had carefully crafted. He would then, in turn, express this worry to Zach, leading to tension. Zach would feel his and Tori's parenting was being questioned, and Matt wouldn't understand the defensiveness because in his mind, he was just echoing the valid concerns that Caryn had raised. Caryn wasn't just driving a wedge between herself and Tori, she was skillfully driving a wedge between father and son. The deception phase escalated as Caryn allegedly became more brazen. She began to position herself as the solution to the very problem she was inventing. "Maybe I should spend a bit more time over at their new house," sources report her suggesting to Matt. Just to give Tori a break. An extra set of eyes never hurts. This was a calculated move to insert herself more directly into Zach and Tori's life, to gain more access, and crucially, to gather more ammunition. Every normal childhood event, every scraped knee, every temper tantrum, every messy room was no longer just a part of life. In Caryn's reported narrative, they were all pieces of evidence, data points in her fabricated case of parental inadequacy. She was meticulously observing and documenting, twisting the beautiful, chaotic reality of raising 3 young children into something ugly and sinister. The ultimate goal, according to these exclusive theories, was to isolate Zach and Tori from Matt. If Matt believed his grandchildren were in a state of quasi-peril, he would naturally rely more on Caryn, the one who was supposedly seeing things clearly. He would see her as his partner in concern, the only other person who truly understood the risks. This would recenter their relationship and push Zach and Tori to the periphery. It was a long game, a psychological war of attrition, and Caryn was allegedly playing it with terrifying precision. The stage was being set for an act so malevolent that it would cross a line from which there could be no return. The passive aggression and whispered concerns were just the prelude. The main attack was yet to come, and it would be more horrific than anyone in the Roloff family could ever fathom. The moment Caryn had been waiting for, The opportunity to escalate her campaign from insidious whispers to direct action reportedly arrived on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon. It was the kind of day familiar to any parent of young children. Tori had taken the kids to a local park, a place of joy and happy memories. Lila, in a burst of toddler enthusiasm, was attempting to climb a small slide. She slipped, as toddlers often do, and tumbled onto the soft wood chips below. She cried for a moment, more out of surprise than pain, and Tori was there in an instant to scoop her up, kiss the non-existent wound, and comfort her. Within minutes, Lila was back to playing, the incident all but forgotten. A non-event, a tiny blip in the landscape of childhood. But for Caryn, who heard about the minor fall from Matt later that day, this was the catalyst. This was her chance. According to our sources, Caryn saw this common playground fall as the final piece of evidence she needed to execute her horrifying plan. In her twisted narrative, this wasn't an accident. It was a clear sign of neglect. Tori, in her mind, had failed to supervise her child properly, resulting in an injury. It didn't matter that the injury was non-existent or that the fall was minor. The story was what mattered. That evening, we are told, Caryn put her plan into motion. The level of premeditation alleged is chilling. She didn't use her own phone. That would be too simple, too traceable. Instead, she drove to a convenience store several towns away and purchased a cheap, disposable burner phone with cash. This was not an act of impulse. It was a cold, calculated decision. She was creating a firewall, a layer of anonymity to protect herself from the destruction she was about to unleash. Finding a quiet, secluded spot, she dialed the number for the state's Child Protective Services hotline. When the operator answered, Caryn's voice, according to those who have theorized about the call, was a masterful performance. It was filled with a faint tremor of anxiety and reluctance. She presented herself as a concerned neighbor who was making the call with a heavy heart. "I really debated whether to call," she might have begun. "I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but I just can't stand by and watch anymore. It's about the children." She then allegedly launched into a meticulously crafted monologue, weaving together a tapestry of lies from the threads of truth she had gathered over months. She didn't make wild, unbelievable accusations. Instead, she used her insider knowledge to make her fabricated story sound terrifyingly credible. She mentioned the children by name: Jackson, Lila, and Josiah. She gave their correct ages. She described their home, Zach and Tori's new house in Battleground, Washington, in enough detail to prove she had been inside. She spoke about the pattern of suspicious injuries. Jackson's scraped knee from the barbecue was no longer a scrape. It was a deep, untreated gash on his leg. Lila's fall at the park was twisted into a story of being left unsupervised on dangerously high playground equipment, resulting in a head injury. She allegedly implied that Tori might be trying to hide the severity of these incidents. She then weaponized the children's dwarfism with chilling cruelty. She reportedly suggested that their medical needs were being neglected, that their parents were not equipped to handle their specific health challenges, and that regular doctor's appointments were being missed. This was a particularly venomous lie, as viewers of the show know Zach and Tori to be incredibly diligent and loving advocates for their children's health. The masterstroke of her deception, sources believe, was how she painted a psychological portrait of the parents. She described Tori as chronically overwhelmed and depressed, often seen crying in her car. She portrayed Zach as passive and unwilling to step in. She created a picture of a household in chaos, where the children were an afterthought. "The house is often a mess," she would have claimed, "and the kids just seem sad. There's a general sense of neglect." The call was a symphony of twisted facts and outright fabrications, all delivered with the convincing tone of a genuinely worried observer. By providing specific private details that no stranger could possibly know, she ensured her report would be taken seriously. She was not just making a complaint, she was framing them, using her privileged access to their lives to build a cage of lies around them. When she hung up, she likely destroyed the burner phone, erasing the most obvious piece of physical evidence. In her mind, the attack was a success. It was anonymous, untraceable, and devastatingly effective. She had lit the fuse and retreated into the shadows, waiting for the explosion that would tear Zach and Tori's world apart. The explosion came without warning on a Thursday morning. Zach and Tori were in the midst of their daily routine, making breakfast, getting the kids ready for the day, the normal, happy chaos of a young family. Then came the knock on the door. It wasn't a friend or a delivery driver. Standing on their doorstep were two strangers, a man and a woman, who identified themselves as caseworkers from the Oregon Department of Human Services Child Protective Services Division. For any parent, this is the ultimate nightmare. The words alone are enough to send a spike of pure ice through your veins. Zach and Tori were utterly blindsided, confused, and terrified. The caseworkers explained in calm, professional tones that they were there to investigate an anonymous report of child neglect and endangerment. The horror of that moment is impossible to overstate. Zach and Tori, whose lives revolve around their children, were suddenly faced with the accusation that they were unfit parents. The caseworkers, following protocol, had to ask invasive, humiliating questions. They asked to inspect the home, looking for signs of hazards or uncleanliness. They asked to see the children, to check them for any signs of injury, bruises, or malnutrition. Zach and Tori, though terrified and shaking, complied with everything. They knew they had nothing to hide, but the very nature of the investigation is an assault on a parent's identity. It plants a seed of self-doubt and public shame. The idea that anyone could look at their loving family and see something dark and neglectful was a psychological blow. The visit, however, did not go as the anonymous caller had planned. The caseworkers were trained professionals, adept at distinguishing between genuine crisis and malicious reporting. What they found at Zach and Tori's home was not a house of neglect. They found a clean, child-proofed home filled with toys and laughter. They saw 3 happy, healthy, and clearly adored children who were thriving. They saw 2 parents who were attentive, engaged, and deeply bonded with their kids. The deep gash on Jackson's leg was a healing scrape. Lila had no signs of a head injury. The entire complaint began to unravel within minutes of their arrival. It became immediately apparent to the experienced social workers that the report was not just unsubstantiated, it was malicious. The caller's intent was not to protect the children, but to harm the parents. The investigation was officially closed almost as soon as it began, with the determination that the claims were unfounded. Zach and Tori were cleared of any wrongdoing, but the emotional trauma lingered. They were left shaken, violated, and with a burning question: who would do this to them? Who would hate them so much that they would try to have their children taken away? The malice was what was so disturbing. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was a calculated attack by someone who knew them, someone who had been in their home, someone who knew the layout of their lives. The list of potential suspects who held that level of intimate knowledge was terrifyingly small. But this is where the story takes a turn that no one, least of all the perpetrator, could have ever predicted. The system had a protocol for situations like this. While most unfounded reports are simply filed away, reports deemed to be deliberately malicious and fabricated are sometimes subject to further internal review. The goal is to identify patterns of harassment against families or individuals. The social worker who visited Zach and Tori's home was deeply troubled by the case. The level of detail, combined with the complete lack of any actual evidence of neglect, flagged the call as particularly vindictive. Per protocol, the audio recording of the anonymous call was forwarded to a supervisor for review, and Here, an incredible coincidence, a 1 in a million chance, changed everything. The supervisor who was assigned the file happened to be a casual viewer of Little People, Big World. She didn't follow the family's lives obsessively, but she would occasionally watch the show to unwind after a long day. As she played the audio file of the anonymous concerned neighbor, she listened intently. The voice was disguised, pitched slightly lower, the words spoken with a forced, shaky cadence. But the disguise wasn't perfect. As she listened again, the supervisor's blood ran cold. She began to recognize it. It wasn't just the tone. It was the specific speech patterns, the unique cadence, the way certain vowels were pronounced. It was the little, almost imperceptible verbal tics that a person has their entire life. She recognized the way the caller would pause for emphasis. She recognized the faint, almost condescending lilt that would creep in when trying to sound concerned. And then she heard it, a tiny, nervous chuckle after making a particularly damning statement, a verbal tic she had seen and heard dozens of times on television. The supervisor leaned back in her chair, a sickening realization dawning on her. She couldn't be 100% certain in a court of law, but in her professional and personal opinion, she knew exactly who had made that call. The anonymous voice on the recording belonged to Caryn Chandler. This revelation presented the supervisor with a profound ethical dilemma. CPS investigations are, by law, shrouded in secrecy to protect the privacy of all involved. The identity of a reporter, even a malicious one, is typically kept confidential. However, the system also has a duty of care to the families it serves. This was not a standard case. This was an act of targeted malicious harassment, using a state agency as a weapon, perpetrated by someone intimately connected to the victims. The supervisor felt that leaving Zach and Tori in the dark, allowing them to live in fear and suspicion while the perpetrator was still in their inner circle, was an abdication of her ethical duty. She consulted with her department's legal counsel, and a decision was made. While they could not provide the audio recording or launch a criminal investigation based on a voice recognition, they could and should inform the family of the nature of the threat. They had a responsibility to warn them that the malicious report came not from a stranger, but from someone they knew very well. A few days later, the lead social worker made a follow-up call to Zach and Tori. It was not a standard procedural call. The tone was somber and serious. After reassuring them once again that the case was closed and their family was safe, the social worker took a deep breath and delivered the bombshell. "Mr. and Mrs. Roloff," she began, choosing her words with extreme care, "I need to tell you something in confidence. We cannot legally disclose the identity of the person who made the report. However, due to the malicious and intimate nature of the fabricated claims, the call was reviewed internally. And we have very strong reason to believe, in almost certainty, that the call was placed by a known associate of your family. Specifically, we believe the caller was a woman named Caryn Chandler." The silence on the other end of the phone was absolute. For Zach and Tori, the world simply stopped turning. It wasn't a suspicion anymore. It wasn't a paranoid theory. A state official, an impartial party with no stake in their family drama, had just identified their attacker. It was a truth more monstrous than anything they could have imagined. Their father's partner, the woman who sat at their dinner table, the woman who held their children and called herself a grandmother figure, had allegedly tried to destroy their family in the most horrific way possible. The betrayal was not just a crack in the foundation. It was a seismic event that leveled the entire structure. The passive-aggressive comments, the feigned concern, the whispers to Matt, it all clicked into place, forming a picture of pure, unadulterated malice. Their grief and shock quickly hardened into a cold, diamond-hard fury. This was not something that could be forgiven. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a declaration of war. And their next move was clear. They had to confront Matt, but they wouldn't be confronting him with a suspicion or a feeling. They would be confronting him with a near certainty, delivered by the very state agency Caryn had tried to weaponize against them. The reckoning was coming. The phone call from the social worker ended, but the silence it left behind was deafening. In that single moment, Zach and Tori's world had been completely and irrevocably reordered. The terrifying shadowy figure who had attacked their family now had a face, a familiar face, the face of Caryn Chandler. The shock was a physical force, a wave of cold that washed over them, leaving them numb. It was the kind of truth the mind initially rejects, a reality so monstrous it feels like a nightmare. But this was real. The detached, professional voice of a government official had given it the horrifying weight of fact. They looked at each other, the same sequence of emotions playing out in their eyes. Pure, unadulterated shock, followed by a surge of white-hot rage, and finally, a deep, soul-crushing sorrow. Tori was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper, but laced with the steel of a mother whose children had been threatened. She held Josiah, Tori said, her eyes welling with tears of fury. She was in our house. She smiled at our kids, and she was planning this. The violation felt absolute. Every memory of Caryn was now tainted, every past interaction re-examined through this new, horrific lens. The passive-aggressive comments about her parenting that Tori had tried to brush off were no longer just petty slights. They were reconnaissance. The concerned questions Caryn would ask Matt about the kids' bruises were not concerned. They were intelligence gathering. She had been a spy in their camp, a predator disguised as a member of the flock, patiently waiting for the moment to strike. For Zach, the betrayal cut even deeper if that was possible. This was his father's partner, the woman his dad had chosen to build a new life with. For years, Zach had navigated the complex dynamics of that relationship, trying to maintain peace for his father's sake. He had tolerated Caryn's increasing influence on the farm and in his father's life. But this was not a family disagreement. This was not a dispute over property or money. This was an attempt to use the power of the state to rip his family apart, to have his children seized and put into the system. It was an act of such profound evil that it transcended all previous family squabbles. It was a wound from which there could be no recovery. Their conversation that night was not about if they should confront Matt, but how. They knew it had to be done immediately, but it also had to be done carefully. They couldn't storm over to the farm screaming accusations. That would give Caryn an opening to play the victim, to gaslight Matt, and paint them as hysterical and paranoid. No, they had to be strategic. They had an advantage, a piece of information that was undeniable. The source of their knowledge was not gossip or suspicion, but a state official. They would present it as such, a fact, not a theory. They also made a critical decision. They had to get to Matt when he was alone. If Caryn was there, she would control the narrative, twisting their words and manipulating Matt in real time. They needed to speak to their father and their father alone. The next morning, Zach called Matt. He kept his voice even, betraying none of the roiling emotions inside him. "Hey, Dad," he said, "Tori and I need to come talk to you about something important. Are you going to be at the farm office this morning? And will you be by yourself?" The specificity of the question might have raised a flag for Matt, but Zach's calm demeanor was disarming. Matt confirmed he'd be there alone, working on some blueprints. The trap was set. The drive to Roloff Farms was the longest of their lives. The familiar road, once a path to a place of childhood memories, now felt like a road to a final battle. They were silent for most of the drive, each lost in their own thoughts, preparing for the conversation that would either save their family or shatter it into a million irreparable pieces. They knew one thing for certain. By the time they left the farm today, the Roloff family, as they knew it, would be over. They found Matt just where he said he would be, poring over designs in his office, a cup of coffee steaming beside him. He looked up with a smile as they entered, a smile that would be wiped from his face moments later. Zach closed the office door behind them, the soft click echoing with a chilling finality. "Dad," Zach began, his voice low and steady, "we have to tell you something. A few days ago, 2 people from Child Protective Services showed up at our house." Matt's face instantly changed. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of confusion and alarm. "What? CPS? Why, are the kids okay?" His grandfatherly instincts kicked in immediately, his mind racing with 1,000 worst-case scenarios. This initial reaction of pure concern for his grandchildren was exactly what Caryn had counted on, the emotional lever she had so expertly used to manipulate him. "The kids are fine, Dad," Tori said, her voice tight. "They came because they received an anonymous report, a very detailed report accusing us of neglect. They said there was a pattern of suspicious injuries, that our house was unsafe, that we weren't taking care of our children." Matt sank into his chair, his face pale. "My God," he whispered, "who would do something like that? That's insane. You guys are wonderful parents." And in that moment, Zach and Tori could see the seeds of doubt Caryn had planted beginning to sprout in Matt's mind, even if he wasn't aware of it. He might have been thinking of Caryn's whispered worries, wondering if there was some small grain of truth, some misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion by an overly zealous neighbor. Zach let the weight of the situation settle in the room before he delivered the final, devastating blow. "They investigated, Dad. They came to the house, they saw the kids, and they closed the case immediately. They said it was completely baseless, but they also said it was malicious. They said the caller's only intent was to hurt our family." He paused, looking his father directly in the eye. "And they did something they don't normally do. Because the call was so specific and vindictive, it was reviewed by a supervisor. Dad, they told us who they believed made the call." Matt leaned forward, his expression a mixture of anger and confusion. "Who? Who was it?" This was the moment of truth. Zach took a deep breath. The CPS supervisor recognized the voice. "From the show, they told us they have strong reason to believe, to a near certainty, that the person who made that call, the person who tried to have our children taken away from us, was Caryn." The denial from Matt was instantaneous and forceful. It was a reflex, a wall of disbelief thrown up to protect his own reality. "No," he said, shaking his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Absolutely not. That is the most ridiculous, insane thing I have ever heard. No, you must have misunderstood them. Caryn loves Jackson and Lila and Josiah. She would never, ever do something like that. She worries about them constantly." "Yes, Dad, she does," Tori shot back, her voice breaking with anger. "She worries to you, doesn't she? She tells you she's worried about their bruises. She tells you I seem overwhelmed. She has been building a case against us with you for months, and you've been listening to her?" "That's not fair," Matt retorted, his voice rising. "She was just being concerned. You're twisting her words. You're looking for someone to blame for this horrible thing, and you're pointing the finger at her." "This isn't us pointing a finger, Dad." Zach's voice was like thunder in the small office. "This is a state official telling us they recognized her voice, her specific cadence, her speech patterns. This is not our suspicion. This is what they told us. Do you understand? The agency she tried to use against us is the one that identified her." The certainty in Zach's voice, the sheer authority of his source, finally pierced Matt's wall of denial. The anger in his eyes began to fade, replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. It was as if a switch had been flipped in his mind. Suddenly, all of Caryn's comments, all her little whispers and feigned concerns began replaying in his head, but this time they were cast in a sinister, demonic light. "I'm a little worried about Jackson's new bruise." Tori seemed so overwhelmed lately. I hope the kids are getting enough supervision. He remembered her telling him about Lila's fall at the park, her voice dripping with manufactured alarm. He had told Caryn that detail in confidence. No one else knew. A concerned neighbor couldn't have known. The timeline, the details, the psychology of it all started to fit together like pieces of a diabolical puzzle. He remembered her constant suggestions to help out more, to be an extra set of eyes at their house. It wasn't an offer of help, it was an attempt to gain more surveillance. He saw, in that horrifying moment of clarity, that he hadn't just been a bystander. He had been an instrument. Caryn had played him like a fiddle, using his deepest love, his love for his grandchildren, as a weapon against his own son. The betrayal was so profound, so multi-layered, that he could barely breathe. Caryn hadn't just betrayed Zach and Tori. She had betrayed him. She had turned his heart into her accomplice. The color drained from his face as he slumped back in his chair, the blueprints on his desk blurring before his eyes. The life he had built with this woman, the future he had imagined, was dissolving into a toxic mirage. Seeing his father's collapse, Zach's voice softened, but his resolve hardened. This was not the time for sympathy. This was the time for an ultimatum. "Dad," he said, his voice cold and clear as ice. "A line has been crossed here that we can never, ever go back from. This woman, the woman you live with, tried to use a government agency to take our children. There is no forgiving that. There is no working through it. There is no family therapy. It's over." Tori stood beside him, her arms crossed, a silent, powerful pillar of agreement. "So you have a choice to make," Zach continued. "It's her or it's us. It's Caryn or it's your son and your grandchildren. You cannot have both. If you choose to stay with her, we are done. You will not see our children again. We will not be in your life. We will not set foot on this farm. This is it. This is the end of the line." What happened next is a moment that insiders can only piece together from the fallout that followed. Matt, broken and in a state of shock, agreed to confront Caryn. Zach and Tori left the farm, the ultimatum hanging in the air, a guillotine waiting to fall. Sources close to the situation say that Matt waited for Caryn to return to the house that evening, his mind a maelstrom of grief and fury. When she walked in, cheerful and oblivious, asking about his day, he didn't mince words. He told her, point blank, about the visit from CPS. He watched her face as he spoke, searching for any flicker of guilt. She performed perfectly, her expression morphing into one of shock and outrage on their behalf. "Oh, Matt, no, that's horrible. Who would do such a sick thing?" "They think it was you, Caryn," Matt said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "They told Zach and Tori the anonymous caller's voice was yours." The performance shattered. For a split second, a flash of pure panic crossed Caryn's face before she quickly replaced it with a mask of wounded indignation. "What?" she shrieked, tears welling in her eyes. "They're blaming me? After all I've done for this family? Afterwards, how much I love those kids? Matt, how can you even listen to that? It's them. They've always wanted to drive a wedge between us. They're turning you against me." She launched into a masterclass of gaslighting and victimhood, crying, pleading, accusing Zach and Tori of being manipulative and cruel. She swore on her life, on her love for him, that she had nothing to do with it. But for Matt, the spell was broken. Her denials, which once would have been enough for him, now sounded hollow and rehearsed. He started asking questions, his voice still quiet, but now with a prosecutor's edge. "How would a stranger know about the specific scrape Jackson got at the barbecue last month, Caryn? The one you were so worried about?" Her eyes darted away for a fraction of a second. "I don't know. Maybe they saw it. Maybe someone else was there." "And Lila's fall at the park," Matt pressed on, his voice colder still. "It happened on a Tuesday. The CPS call was made that night. The only person who knew about that fall besides Zach and Tori was me. And the only person I told was you. So how did the concerned neighbor know about that, Caryn? Her denials began to falter. They became more frantic, less coherent. Finally, according to one report, she broke, but not with a confession. She broke with a justification. I was just so worried, she allegedly cried. They're so young and Tori is so overwhelmed. I thought maybe a visit, a little scare, would be a wake-up call for them to be more careful. I never thought it would go this far. I never thought they would actually investigate. And there it was. Not a confession to malice, but a confession to the act. It was a self-serving, pathetic attempt to reframe an act of war as an act of misguided concern. But for Matt, it was enough. It was the confirmation of the unthinkable. The woman he loved had, by her own admission, deliberately sicked a state agency on his family. The fallout was swift and seismic, though largely invisible to the public eye. The relationship between Matt and Caryn from that moment on was fractured beyond repair. Whether they officially split immediately or are simply living out a hollow charade for the sake of appearances and business, the trust and love that once existed are dead. More importantly, the ultimatum from Zach and Tori became the new law of the land. This alleged event, this grandkid plot, is the secret key that unlocks everything that has happened since. It explains the real reason behind the sudden bitter end of the farm sale negotiations. It was never truly about money. How could Zach buy a piece of the farm and enter into a lifelong partnership with his father, knowing he might have to interact with the woman who tried to steal his children? The deal was dead before it even began. It explains the move to Battleground, Washington. It wasn't just about a bigger house or a change of scenery. It was a strategic retreat. It was about creating distance, a buffer zone, a state line between their children and Caryn Chandler. It was about building a fortress where they could feel safe. It explains the deafening silence on social media, the lack of family photos, the separate holidays. The family has been cleaved in two. On one side, Zach, Tori, and their children, supported by Amy, who, according to sources, was horrified but not entirely surprised to hear of Caryn's capacity for such deception. Amy's own long-standing reservations about Caryn were tragically vindicated. On the other side is Matt, trapped in a gilded cage with a woman he now knows is capable of monstrous acts, isolated from his son and the grandchildren who were his greatest joy. What we have seen play out on our television screens and on social media is a carefully edited fiction. The show can't tell this story. The legal and moral implications are too severe. So they feed us a sanitized narrative of business disagreements and growing pains. But what our sources have pieced together is a story of Shakespearean tragedy, of jealousy so corrosive it drives a person to commit an unspeakable act. Caryn Chandler, feeling her power wane, allegedly chose to burn the kingdom to the ground rather than lose her place next to the king. In doing so, she didn't just drive a wedge into the Roloff family, she detonated a bomb at its very heart. The shrapnel from that explosion is what we are seeing now, in the form of a fractured family and a broken father. The grandkid plot was a success in the most tragic way imaginable. It did, in the end, tear the Roloff family apart. And from a betrayal this deep, this dark, and this personal, there is no coming back.